Sunday. Good to see you. Hey, thank you so much for coming. Well, as you know, we are studying at an in-depth level Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. For 18 weeks, we have been unpacking this, the greatest sermon of all time. If you are new to New Day, yes, you are walking in on the tail end of this powerful teaching of Jesus from this amazing sermon. But the good news is that if you go to your app store and download our free New Day Eastvale app, you can watch the entire series under the media section of the app. It will be more than worth your while to do so. Well, as we've mentioned multiple times now, when Jesus gave this sermon, he gave it on the front end of his 3.5-year earthly ministry. He preached it in an open-air setting in the northern part of Israel, atop what's known as the Mount of Beatitudes, overlooking the Sea of Galilee. Now, as Jesus nears the end of his famous sermon, Jesus is about to warn those who would become a follower of his, warn them about something that is going to take place after his earthly ministry is over and he has ascended back to heaven. In other words, as Jesus nears the end of his sermon, he has the end of his earthly ministry in view. You will remember that after his death, burial, and resurrection in the southern part of Israel, the two women who went to the tomb were instructed to go back and tell the disciples to meet Jesus back up north in Galilee. So the guys went up north, and after not seeing Jesus right away, Peter said that he was going to go fish. The other guys went with him, and while they were doing that, Jesus came along the shore and called out to them. And once Peter realized that it was the Lord, he jumped in the water and swam like crazy to get to Jesus. Now, this is where it's believed that this event took place. Jesus, you will recall, prepared breakfast for them. And this church is built around where it's believed that Jesus prepared and placed that breakfast. And this is that place. The bare rock that you see is known as Mensa Christi, which means the table of Christ. Jesus would ascend back to heaven not long after this event. This location is just 2.3 miles from the top of the Mount of Beatitudes. So where Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount and issuing the warning about what will occur after his earthly ministry, Jesus is just a short distance from where his earthly ministry will be winding down. And could probably almost even see that location. With that, let's get into today's message. In Matthew 7:15-20, Jesus says, watch out for what? False prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? The implied answer is of course not. Likewise, Jesus says, every good tree bears good fruit, and a bad tree bears what? Bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown where? Into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. Okay, as indicated, even though Jesus was on the front end of his 3.5-year earthly ministry when he preached his famous sermon, he knew that when his work and time on earth was completed and he ascended back to heaven, that there would be those who would come along and who would pose a real danger to God's community of people, the church. which Jesus was in the process of establishing and would establish prior to his return to heaven. And so beginning at verse 15 of today's passage, Jesus is letting all who enter the small gate so as to travel on the narrow road that we discussed last time. Jesus is letting them know up front that wolves will come once he's gone. And they will come disguised as sheep to try to malign, misguide, rip off, and take advantage of real sheep. You and me and the true followers of Jesus that preceded us and the true followers of Jesus that will come after us. Such ravenous wolves have appeared from time to time over the past 2,000 years, just as Jesus and his handpicked apostles said that they would. This brings us to number one on your outline, so I hope you take good notes today. There's plenty to take down. Filling in, false prophets and other deceivers. During biblical times, in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, prophets were basically those who received messages and predictions directly from God. Prophets were people called by God, and they were to share those messages and those predictions with certain individuals or with the people of God as a whole. A prophet would foretell things that were to come, and they would foretell messages God had supernaturally implanted in them to preach to the people. In both the Old Testament and New Testament, there were men and women that would arise from time to time who claimed to be God's messenger, and that claimed to have a message or a prediction from God, but who were not God's messengers at all. But false prophets who foretell and foretell to mislead and deceive the people of God by what they preach and prophesy, false prophets are not the only pretenders to watch out for. For Jesus and his handpicked apostles warned of other pretenders that will show up from time to time throughout history as well. For example, in Matthew 24:24, Jesus says, for false what? Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, Jesus says, I have told you what? Ahead of time. I'm telling you ahead of time. And in 2 Corinthians 11, verses 4 and 13, the Apostle Paul says, for if someone comes to you, you Christians, and preaches a Jesus other than the Jesus we preach, or a different gospel, such men are false what? Apostles, deceitful workmen, masquerading as apostles of Christ. And then in 2 Peter 2:1, the Apostle Peter tells us, but there were also false prophets among the people, in the Old Testament, just as there will be false what? Teachers among you. They will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the sovereign Lord who bought them with his blood, bringing swift destruction on themselves. False prophets, false Christs, false apostles, and false teachers. The followers of Jesus are warned to watch out for spiritual deceivers that will show up on the scene from time to time. We are to watch out for them because they can bring spiritual harm to us as individuals and to the Lord's church as a whole. Watch out, Jesus says near the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Spiritual deceivers, religious scam artists, and maligners of the truths of God that have been given by Jesus, by his handpicked apostles, and by the Old Testament writers. Spiritual deceivers, religious scam artists, and maligners of the truths of God will come. And they will come among the followers of Jesus to do different kinds of things. Some of these people will obviously be evilly motivated, but some will be sincere but misguided. But either way, they are to be watched out for. With that, let me give you some examples. And some of what I'm going to say is going to be politically incorrect. But here at New Day, we're not interested in being politically correct. We're interested in knowing the truth of God, right? Okay, years ago, in the first church the Lord enabled me to plant, a woman who had a very ill child heard of a particular faith healer who was going to be holding services in Orange County. And she wanted to take her son to that service. And so she called to get information about this healing event. She was told that for a certain amount of money, she could sit in the seats that the pastor would be primarily calling people up on stage from to provide a healing. And the woman was told that for half that amount of money, she could sit in the maybe section, i.e. the section that the pastor might call people up on stage from. Does this sound right to you? Some of the wolves Jesus and his handpicked apostles warn about are of the sort that prey upon the fears of the sick and their loved ones. The aim of these wolves is to extract money out of these poor people. These vulnerable souls give their money, their loved one experiences a temporary psychosomatic type of healing, only to wake up the next morning to find that they are still very ill. That's current time. In the Middle Ages, during a sad period in the history of the Catholic Church, a priest by the name of John Tetzel went out to raise money for one of the bad popes. There have been many good ones, but he went out to raise money for one of the bad ones. And this particular pope wanted money for a building project. So John Tetzel went out and sold what were called indulgences. And in this particular situation, if you gave a certain amount of money, the Pope would liberate a loved one of yours that you believed was in purgatory suffering for some sin that they owed God before they could be allowed to go into heaven. In short, you would give John Tetzel money and your loved one would be sprung by the Pope from purgatory. John Tetzel was credited with hawking such indulgences for the dead by saying, when a penny in the coffer rings, finish it with me, a soul from purgatory springs. This really happened. This really happened. Watch out for false prophets or wolves, Jesus says. And for those who are wondering, the answer is no. There is no such place as purgatory. So that's the Middle Ages. Back in the first century, some years after Jesus had ascended back to heaven, and speaking of false teachers who were already on the scene and taking advantage of people for personal financial gain, the Apostle Paul writes to a young minister by the name of Titus. He writes these words. He says, there are many rebellious people, mere talkers, and what? Deceivers. They must be silenced because they are ruining whole households by teaching things they ought not teach, and that for the sake of what? Dishonest gain. Beware of the wolves, the false prophets, false teachers, false apostles, and false Christ. They will come among we believers from time to time. They'll look like sheep, like followers of Jesus. They'll talk Christian talk. They'll know and quote Scripture. They may even have a compassionate and loving air about them, but that's just a facade to get us to trust them. Watch out for such imposters, Jesus says. And then Jesus goes on in our Matthew 7 passage this morning to give us some help on how to identify the imposters. This brings us to number 2 on your outlines, filling in the good and bad fruit test. In verses 16 through 20 of today's text, Jesus says, by their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? No. Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Finish it with me? Go. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. Now, through a thorough examination of the New Testament as a whole, here are some of the kinds of bad fruit that get produced by bad trees. Filling in. Blasphemous statements about Jesus. Bad trees a wolf is going to make blasphemous statements about Jesus. You might think about the Pharisees who told Jesus that when he performed miracles that he was doing it by the power of Satan. That's attributing the power of God to the power of Satan. That's blasphemous, right? Next, the teaching of doctrines not consistent with the teachings of Jesus and his apostles. That's bad fruit. We'll give you an example of that in a moment. Next, filling in, overall ungodly character. That passage there lists a whole bunch of unrighteous character traits. If a person's a Christian leader and you see these traits in their lives, then that's a bad tree, that's a false prophet. Next, filling in, teaching about a different Jesus than the Jesus the apostles talk about. That's happened multiple times through the centuries. We will talk about a couple of those. Next, filling in, the pursuit of dishonest financial gain. That's the kind of bad fruit that bad trees, false prophets bear. Next, filling in, leading the people of God toward the practice of immorality. We'll give you an example of that as well. Filling in, finally, no genuine conversions or authentic spiritual growth among those being taught. So that if you see a bad tree, a wolf, they're going to be teaching, but you're not going to see any real conversions going on and no real spiritual growth going on. That's fruit that helps you identify the bad tree. Now, a good tree will bear fruit that is the opposite of all that we've just listed. So we do not need to list what all that good fruit would be because you are smart people and can readily discern what the opposites of what we just listed are for yourselves. Besides, Jesus' main purpose in this morning's passage is to warn us about the wolves and the bad trees, and to give us some help in being able to identify the bad trees. So having listed some of the bad fruit and bad trees and what they'll bear, where and how has such fruit been manifested in recent years and in more modern times? Well, here are some examples of where and how I've seen it being manifested in recent decades. And so I've seen these things happen over years because I've been in ministry for a long time. About 3 decades ago, I was reading a book by a leader from a liberal segment of the Presbyterian Christian denomination. And this pastor, this leader, was trying to argue in this book that sex before marriage between consenting mature adults who have been dating for some time is okay. Also, about 3 decades ago, the liberal arm of the Episcopalian Church began to teach that the practice of homosexuality is not something that falls outside the revealed will of God and that it's not a sin. The liberal segments of other denominations have done the same since that time. Both examples just given are of teachers within the Lord's church leading the people of God toward the practice of immorality. Remember we said one of the bad fruit is that they're going to do that. They're going to lead the people of God toward the practicing of immorality. Many preachers and teachers within the Disciples of Christ denomination, and I know this because I have a family member who's in this denomination, many preachers and teachers within the Disciples of Christ have been teaching for some time now that it doesn't matter if a person follows Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, or some other religious figure because they claim in the Disciples of Christ that all spiritual roads lead to God. This is completely inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus and his handpicked apostles. I mean, where's the small gate and the narrow road that leads to life that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount? It seems like what some of the teachers in these denominations are attempting to do is to widen that small gate and broaden that narrow road, making them more like the wide gate and the broad road that Jesus says leads to destruction. Well, then moving on, about 15 years ago, I heard a knock on my front door. And when I opened it, there was a man who handed me a pamphlet. And the pamphlet was entitled, "The End of False Religion is Near." What's ironic was that the pamphlet was published by the Watchtower Society, a publication of the Jehovah's Witnesses. The Jehovah's Witnesses are the very ones who teach that Jesus is not the eternally existent Son of God who's co-equal with God the Father, but rather that Jesus was really the Archangel Michael, a created being. Folks, I don't know how deep your theology is, but that is blasphemous. It is the very worst kind of bad fruit that gets produced by bad trees. It gets proclaimed by false prophets. Speaking of false prophets in modern history, Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormon Church, is absolutely one of those false prophets. Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, a book that purports a history of the Americas that is not supported by a single archaeological find, not one. Joseph Smith claimed he wrote the Book of Mormon from the contents inscribed on buried golden plates that an angel by the name of Moroni had directed him to. Joseph Smith said that he was able to translate the reformed Egyptian inscriptions on the plates with a miraculous pair of glasses given him by Moroni. Multiple problems, but one of the problems is that no such language as reformed Egyptian has ever existed, as any Egyptologist and philologist would tell you. Anyway, this is the same Joseph Smith who claimed that he received a revelation from God to practice polygamy. Further, when one really digs in, one discovers that Mormonism teaches that there is not one God, but many gods. And that the God of this particular planet is an exalted flesh and blood man who had physical sex with Mary, which is why Mormonism denies the biblical doctrine of the virgin birth. And by the way, Mormonism also teaches that Jesus and Satan are brothers. These doctrines are in no way consistent with the teachings of Jesus and his handpicked apostles. This is the kind of bad fruit that gets produced by bad trees and gets proclaimed by false prophets. Okay, moving on. About 17 years ago, my ministry mentor, Pastor Floyd Strader, passed away at age 84 a few years ago. He informed me, about 17 years ago, he informed me about some leaders from a religious cult that targeted some of our old declining Christian churches to infiltrate. And they came in pretending to be sheep, but all the while they were wolves that had bad, evil intent. Their strategy was to mingle with the sheep, earn trust, and over time get themselves elected or appointed to the boards of these churches. And they did this so that when the churches finally reached the point of having to close their doors, these wolves in sheep clothing would be in the necessary legal leadership positions that would allow them to authorize the sale of the properties and the proceeds of which they would then donate to their religious cult. Watch out for false prophets and other deceivers. Jesus and his hand-picked apostles warned. You can recognize the good trees from the bad trees by the fruit they bear. And we've highlighted some of the kinds of bad fruit that get produced by those bad trees. And in regards to the false prophets, deceivers, or bad trees, Jesus says this concerning their ultimate outcome. In Matthew 7:20, Jesus says, every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and what? Thrown into the fire. That is, their ultimate outcome will be hell. Jesus says. With that, let's move on to number 3 on your outlines, filling in. Jesus said, watch out for. He did not say, go looking for. To bring some balance and perspective to what we've been learning up to this point this morning, I think it's important to note that the majority of Christian teachers, leaders, and pastors out there are good trees that bear good fruit. They are men and women who are working hard to reach the lost, teach God's word, and advance God's kingdom. With that in view, let me give you some very current statistics. 90% of pastors feel called by God to be pastors. 80%, though, feel that pastoral ministry has negatively affected their families. And many pastors' children, as adults, do not attend church because of what people in the church had done to their parents. 54% of pastors find the role of pastor overwhelming. 35% of pastors battle depression or fear inadequacy. 70% of pastors report they have a lower self-image now than when they first started. 70% of pastors do not have someone they can consider to be a close friend. In other words, they're lonely. 57% of pastors feel fulfilled but yet discouraged, stressed, and fatigued. Many Christian denominations are now reporting an empty pulpit crisis. They do not have a short of ministers who will take regular staff positions, but they have a shortage of ministers desiring to fill the role of a pastor. Over 1,500 pastors left the ministry every month last year. Over 1,300 pastors were terminated by the local church each month as well, and many without cause. And only 1 out of every 10 pastors will retire as a pastor. Means they go make a living doing something else. Folks, this is not good news for the Lord's church in America. This is not good news at all. By and large, pastors have not been treated well for the past several decades. 72% are working between 55 to 75 hours per week. 57% feel they do not receive a livable wage. 52% of pastors feel overworked and that they cannot meet their church's unrealistic expectations. And 40% report serious conflict with a parishioner at least once in any given 12-month period. In a recent survey, the profession of pastor came in near the bottom of most respected positions or professions. Pastors came in just above car salesmen. How do you think that makes us feel? And why am I sharing this with you? I'm sharing it because pastors have a challenging enough time, as it is, without having to deal with what we refer to in ministry as heresy hunters. Heresy hunters. Heresy hunters are those Christians who take what Jesus says in Matthew 7:15-20 and make it their mission in life to go out and try to find false teaching in everything pastors and other Christian leaders say. We call these people heresy hunters because that's what they do, i.e. they go out and hunt for heresies and things they can call false teaching, and they make those of us who are out trying to make a difference in people's lives for God, they make us miserable. Heresy hunters will often make those of us who are good trees that bear good fruit spend so much of our time and energy trying to defend ourselves that we don't have anything left in us to get anything productive done for God. The heresy hunters wear us out, they discourage us, and they make our job harder than it already is. Heresy hunters, among others, are ones who have contributed to the massive number of pastors that leave the ministry every single year. Do you understand? There is a shortage of pastors. Churches think, we'll get rid of this pastor, we'll get another. Maybe not. Maybe not. Now I should say quickly, don't worry, I'm not leaving the ministry. And no heresy hunters have been making my life miserable as of late. They have in the past, now I just beat them up. Ask for forgiveness. Besides, and I feel blessed that this is the case, God did create me in such a way that I am of the very resilient sort, evidenced by the fact that I've been in full-time ministry for almost 40 years now. And I've been the preaching pastor of the two churches that the Lord has enabled me to plant for a total of almost 30 years. Over 17 of those years have been here. So again, do not worry. I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me. Amen. What I'm doing is I just want to make sure, folks, that you understand that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus does not say, go looking for false teachers and bad trees. No. Jesus says, watch out for false prophets, because they will appear on the scene from time to time. And Jesus says, we recognize a bad tree by the kind of fruit that it bears, and we've listed from Scripture the kind of bad fruit that such trees produce. Hopefully you recognize that I'm one of those good trees. Thousands of people have made first-time decisions for Jesus through my life and ministry. Thousands. That's good fruit. So hopefully you recognize that. Again, I want to mention that the majority of pastors are good trees and do bear good fruit. And the way these faithful servants of God are to be treated is stated in Scripture. In Hebrews 13:17, God says to the people of God this. Read it with me, good and strong. Obey your leaders and submit to their authority. They keep watch over you as men who must give an account to God. Obey them so that their work will be a joy